You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan. This is episode 119, covering the week of April 30th through May 4th, 2018. Glad to be back on the program. Very glad to have you here. If you do like this podcast, please share it around on social media, and you can find us on social media on Facebook. You can like us there at Abbeville Institute. You can follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, and you can subscribe to our YouTube page where we've got all of the lectures up from our most recent conference in Charleston, South Carolina back in February. That's at Abbeville INST as well. If you don't want to go out and find all those things, just go to our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. At the top of the page, you got all our social media buttons. And while you're there, give us an email address, and we'll give you a free ebook, Kirkpatrick Sales Emancipation Hell. And you'll get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday, along with our weekly email, including a link to this podcast there. Also, just want to remind you about this podcast. If you do enjoy it, please go out to iTunes and leave a review. The more reviews, the better, and it does help move the podcast up the line, so to speak, in terms of visibility. Also, we do exist on your generous contributions alone, so if you do like what we do, whether you like our podcast, our website, our educational programs, our summer schools, conferences, you can give a tax-deductible donation to the Abbeville Institute. Just go to our webpage. At the top of the page, you'll see a button that says support, and then it'll be donor options. We have a new donor option interface, so you can go out there and look at that. It's a little easier, I think, smoother to go on out and donate money. Also, you can download our application, our web app, which will include a podcast every week. So go out and get our web application. Just look for Abbeville Institute in your favorite application store. You can get our Abbeville Institute gear. Just go at the same page where it says support and has shop. Click on that. You can get your Abbeville Institute shirts, all embroidered, hats, great stuff, fleece. I know it's getting to summer, so nobody wants fleece, but we've got it. We've got golf towels, too, if you want those. So we got some good stuff there. And just want to remind you that our summer school is coming up, July 15th through 20th, our 16th annual summer school in Seabrook Island, South Carolina. So you can only get on that. It's Southern Identity through Southern Music. It's going to be a grand time. I think you're really going to enjoy it, but space is limited. We only have about 50 slots, and it does fill up quickly. So make sure you go to the website, look at the information for that, and then contact Dr. Livingston about getting your seat reserved. We do have limited space, but we will have Bobby Horton as our keynote performer during the banquet on the Wednesday of the week. So you're going to want to come see Bobby Horton, plus a lot of the other great talks that we have scheduled. I'll be doing 2 talks, so you're going to want to come out to the summer school, Southern Identity through Southern Music. It'll be a great time and well worth your efforts to be there. And if you got a high school, advanced high school student, an undergraduate or graduate student that you know that would benefit from this, let Dr. Livingston know, because we love to have students. And scholarships are available. Okay, all of that said, let's talk about the material for the week. In fact, I'm going to focus on essentially 3 of the pieces this week. Just briefly mention 2 of them, and I'll start with those 2. And then I want to focus on the general theme of these other 3 pieces. And it was actually the Monday, Wednesday, Friday pieces that kind of work together. So we had a couple of other pieces. We had a piece, our book review of the week was entitled The Last Gasp, and it's was written by John Watley, and it's about a book entitled The Last Hurrah by Kyle Sinise. And Kyle Sinise wrote this book about the Sterling Price Missouri expedition of 1864. And essentially, the review gets into the details of the book and how this was, in many ways, the last gasp of not of the Western theater and maybe even of the entire war, because the South was not able to win this particular element of the Western theater, the Western campaign. Of course, the end result was disaster after that. So this really was the last gasp that the South had in trying to wrestle the West from the Union Army. And so, for that reason, if you're a military history fan or you like the war and you like military history, this is, as Watley says, a good book to read on that particular case. But it doesn't really fit with much of the theme for the week. So I just wanted to mention it briefly. And then the piece on Thursday, The Sensory Poetry of DuBose Hayward by Michael Martin. Again, another interesting piece that has to do with Southern literature and how DuBose Hayward is not really that well known. But he is an important part of the Southern literary renaissance, and it had a lot to do with the way that he viewed home and place and the senses. And so Michael Martin's very interested in sensory history. There is a professor at the University of South Carolina, Mark Smith, that's a sensory historian, and that's an interesting field, I'll say. It's not one of those fields that you would think is very comprehensive. I mean, you look at history in a different way. It's one of these little subfields, but it is interesting. And in this particular case, it's getting the feel of the sensory feel of the poetry and the emotion behind it, which is what Michael Martin focuses on here. So it's an interesting piece about a little-known figure in Southern literature, but again, it doesn't really fit with the other two pieces of the week in terms of the theme I want to talk about. So let's get into that, because I think this particular theme is important. In fact, the Wednesday piece is where I'm going to start. And this was widely read, very popular, got a lot of comments about it. But it was the piece by Boyd Cathy entitled How the Neocons Destroyed Southern Conservatism. Now, this is a story that a lot of people are familiar with. But unfortunately, if you look at Conservative Inc., which is what dominates Fox News, your major quote-unquote conservative publications, National Review, Weekly Standard, these type of things, or even unfortunately some other online places like townhall.com, where it's not so bad there. I will say that. It's not so bad there. Town Hall tries to be pretty eclectic on what they bring in, but particularly with what used to be the standard publications, National Review being one of them. You have what's called Conservative Inc. These are what we would call today the never-Trumpers and these type of people. But how did these people get into this position where they can dominate what is viewed as conservative? Now, if you're a conservative, and maybe you're not a conservative, maybe you're a libertarian, maybe you're a moderate. I mean, whatever you are, whatever your position on the political spectrum is, you're familiar with conservatism. If you're a conservative, you probably came to that position, particularly if you're younger. Maybe it was your family that got you interested in conservatism, but if you came to it kind of on your own, you probably did it by watching mainstream conservative publications like Fox News. And if you get that, you get a heavy dose of Conservative Inc. And Conservative Inc. is dominated by the Neoconservatives. Now, you don't know it when you're watching this. You think that's conservative. I mean, this is what they're telling me. This is conservative. This is what this means. But if you become curious enough to peel back the layers of this position, this Conservative Inc., you find that what these people are is really not conservative at all. And they're not really interested in tradition. Now, they say they are. And this is actually Hillsdale College, too, in terms of the administration, not the faculty there. But the administration at Hillsdale certainly is part of this neoconservative, Straussian, Japha'ite legacy that's now changed American conservatism. And so what Dr. Cathy does here very well is peel back the layers on this. And what happened? How did this group come to power? How did this group become so dominant in American quote-unquote conservatism? And he points that out very clearly. It's money, the amount of money they had. But what they're able to do is push out the old right and, by default, Southern conservatives. You see, Southern conservatives and the old right had a firm alliance. And not just that, paleo-libertarians as well, people like Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard, from New York, a Jewish guy from New York, was, in the 1940s, rallying for Strom Thurmond. In New York, he's saying, yeah, we got to support Strom Thurmond, because he was old right in many ways. And he's a paleo-libertarian, but he was old right. And he saw in the old right and the Southern conservatives a consistency that he wanted to follow. Now, Murray Rothbard was not interested in the race issue at all. At all, really. I mean, it was something else. But it was about power. And it's about what the neoconservative establishment, eventually the neoconservative establishment, wanted. And at that time, in 1948, it was Dewey and Truman. Of course, it was Dewey, the guy from New York who had locked up Lucky Luciano, and of course that was his claim to fame. But it wasn't just that. It was what he represented, which was Rockefeller Republicanism, which is just a moderate form of New Deal Democrats. That's all they really were. They were just a variation of the New Deal Democrats, a softer, kinder, gentler, a much more lenient New Deal Democrat. Still nationalist, still an agreement with an abusive central government, still essentially an agreement with an aggressive foreign policy abroad. That was the other thing. They were internationalists. And so you had developing in the 1940s, certainly an old right group. And then by the 1950s into the 60s, that Rockefeller-type internationalist Republican merged with people that were on the left at one point, but then saw, we've gone a little too far, we need to scale back, but yet we still believe in certain tenets. And that one particular tenet was that America is a proposition nation. America is built on the proposition that all men are created equal. And it's that, as Bradford, as Boyd Cathy talks about in this piece, as Mel Bradford pointed out, he called it the heresy of equality. There's two types of equality. There's equality with a capital E and equality with an uppercase E. Capital E and equality with a lowercase e. So you have capital E, lowercase e. Equality with a capital E is equality of condition. This is what the left really wants. And in some ways, it's what the neoconservatives kind of want, even though they don't say that. But it's an equality of condition, an equality that can never be achieved. There is equality under the law, which is always a desirable outcome. But equality of condition is French revolutionary. I mean, that's what that is. And so if you start advocating this equality with a capital E, you are a French Jacobin. You are, and this is not what Jefferson and that group, they were not believers in equality with a capital E. And that line to them, to Jefferson in particular, as he said, his expression of the American mind really didn't mean a whole lot. The rest of the document, the final paragraph of the Declaration, was more important because it established how Americans thought about government. More than anything else, he did mention that, of course, in that second paragraph, you have a right and a duty to abolish a tyrannical government. But the end of it, with the United States, where we have free and independent states, that was the important part, as Jefferson made clear over and over again in his political career. So you get this, and this becomes very Lincolnian. Lincoln, of course, played on this. And so these national Republicans, establishment national Republicans like Dewey, and then later on the neoconservatives, ran with that stuff. And they create this very strange, as Boyd Cathy says, unpatriotic, because they become internationalists. The job of America then is to spread liberty and democracy to the world, to spread equality to the world. That's unpatriotic. That's not actually supporting America. And they forget what the Union is. The Union is only so good. It only is, we can have federalism, for example, as long as federalism doesn't get in the way of nationalism. Because if it gets in the way of nationalism, then we're Lincolnians. You just steamroll it. So you don't have it anymore. This is where, Barry Goldwater, 1964, was kind of pushing back. And there was an ad. When Barry Goldwater was running for president in 1964, there was an ad of a conservative pundit smoking a cigarette saying, well, I just can't in good conscience vote for Barry Goldwater. It's the same kind of stuff you had in 2016. What you saw in 2016 with Trump was a resurrection of the battles of the middle of the 1960s, and when Southern conservatives were essentially booted out, and then again in 1981, when Bradford was swept aside by the neoconservatives, when Bradford was being considered for a federal post. And the neoconservatives wanted the Crystals in particular wanted nothing of it. And Bill Bennett, we don't want Mel Bradford, who said some terrible things about Abe Lincoln. We don't want him around controlling where we can send money for the humanities. We don't want that. So we got to get rid of this guy. Point me, Bill Bennett. And Reagan buckled, and he pushed Bradford's nomination aside, and he got the neoconservatives. And of course, the neoconservatives were just kind of this fringe. People just laughed at them, didn't pay attention, but they were relentless. And eventually they got the reins of power, and this is why Conservative Inc. is essentially neoconservative. And people don't even know this. They think, oh, we're conservative. But again, that's because they don't read anything, they don't study anything, they don't understand that neoconservatism was not conservative. It never has been. And Southern conservatives, as Boyd gets into here, aligned themselves with the old right because it was about tradition. And Russell Kirk spoke very favorably about the old right, about Southern conservatives, because they had a lot in common. Tradition, most importantly. Tradition. This is why Bradford wrote a book, Remembering Who We Are. We have to remember who we are. And that's the heart of Southern conservatism. It's tradition over anything else. Place, family, tradition. And Southerners were that way. And he put a quote there from Bradford, said, look, there was no abstract. Again, this gets into gets into Larry Tice's position about pro-slavery, that Southerners didn't even think about that until the 1840s, really, into the 1830s and 40s. Calhoun was just echoing something in the 1830s that had already been said over and over again in the North before he said it about slavery as a positive good. But Southerners were not abstract thinkers. They had slavery because it worked within the system that they had there. That was it. It wasn't because they were rigid ideologues. That was found in the North. In the North, you had the rigid ideologues. In the South, not so much. It was tradition. And this is where Southerners talked about it that way. Well, I mean, yeah, it's an evil that we inherited. What are we going to do? This is tradition. This is something we have. Jefferson's saying, I'd love to get rid of it, but I don't know what to do with it. We inherited this evil. We've got this evil. We just have to live with this evil that we have now because of tradition. Whereas Northerners were the abstract thinkers. We have pro-slavery ideology. We have abolitionist ideology, and they were butting heads in the 1820s. In fact, the very first pro-slavery tract written in North America that anybody can find was written in 1701 from a Massachusetts theologian. 1701, not in the South, but in Massachusetts. And you find that's the case on down through the 18th century. But this particular piece, and I digress there in talking about that issue, but this particular piece gets into the destruction of conservatism in America and how actually terrible that is for the future of America. Because tradition is being destroyed. And when you start destroying tradition, that's when you start taking apart society. And that is the goal of everything. If you look at what's going on in the news now, with they're tearing apart tradition more than anything else. That's what's under attack. Whether it's Southern symbols and Southern statues, that's the low-hanging fruit. They're going to get rid of that because they can, if it's not blocked by law. They're going to get rid of those things. But as soon as they get rid of that, they're going to go after something else in tradition. Whether it's tenets of Christianity, which are under attack, maybe even the founding itself. I mean, they're going to want to people have talked, we need to get rid of the Constitution because it's racist or whatever the case may be. But what they're going after is tradition. That is the aim. That is the goal. Take apart tradition. And Northerners long recognized the South was the block because the South was not ideological. The South was traditional. Even Jefferson himself, as much as people talk about Jefferson the ideologue, and in many ways he was, but he was also very traditional, and this is where we've talked about in this podcast, Jefferson as conservative, and on the website, and Clyde Wilson wrote a wonderful piece 40 years ago on that particular topic. But this is where that comes. Jefferson was a man of Virginia, first and foremost, and he was traditional in the sense of being a Virginian. He was firmly committed to federalism because that protected Virginia. His reforms stopped at the state line. Didn't go beyond that. He didn't look to reform anything else. He accepted things as they were. America as it is. That's important. And so when you start looking at the ideologues, these ideologues began to bristle at the South as early as the 1790s. And they started saying, wait a second here. We got a South that's not in line with us. We got to get out of this union. That's the piece on Friday entitled The Essex Junto. This is a little-known group of Federalists who wanted to secede from the Union. There were Northerners who wanted out, New England Federalists who wanted out, and of course, the plan revolved around Aaron Burr and then ultimately Alexander Hamilton. This is one of the reasons why Hamilton and Burr fought a duel, and Burr ends up killing Hamilton, because Hamilton was thwarting Burr's political ambition to be president of the Northern Confederacy. New York was the key to the scheme. If New York leaves, then the rest of New England can get out. And you go back and look at it now and you think, why couldn't that just have happened? Why couldn't New England just have seceded in 1803 when the plan was discussed, or 1804? And remember, we have to remember, New England secession was discussed as early as 1794. 5 years after the first Congress met, we've got discussion of New England secession when Rufus King and Oliver Ellsworth cornered John Taylor of Caroline in a cloakroom in the Senate and said, John, this thing isn't working, we got to get out. And John Taylor was shocked. Wait a second, we've only had this union 5 years, and New England's already saying, no, this isn't going to work. And then, of course, they bring it up with Jefferson's election, and this little piece talks about that. They bring it up with the Louisiana Purchase. They bring it up again in the War of 1812. It was New England that was pioneering secession, and they were pioneering secession because they were ideologues. And they didn't like the Union as it was. It wasn't doing what they wanted. It wasn't being as active as they needed it to be. It wasn't protecting their interests. You see, New England nationalism, quote unquote, has always been New England sectionalism, disguised as nationalism. They've always been sectionalists. They've always been out for New England first. The world has to be New England. That is the neoconservative view of America. It's the city upon a hill ideology. You have to be us. If you're not us, we don't like you. We don't want to be with you. Or you're going to convert or die. You're going to convert or die. And so that's when you get into this Southern conservatism, this debate here of the old right and booting aside by the neoconservatives. And then, of course, you've got this Essex junto very clearly showing that the North was driving the earliest discussions of secession because to them the Union wasn't working, because it wasn't working for New England. Whereas Southerners were real nationalists. I mean, Jefferson's a real nationalist. He wants the Union to be beneficial for all. This is why he said we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. And Jefferson was not particularly ideological in the executive branch. It's why the old Republicans, the Quids, got so upset with Jefferson because he was acting like a Federalist at times. He wasn't ideological in the executive mansion. So, and of course, the Quids weren't ideological either. They're looking at tradition. They're looking at restraint of power, more importantly, than anything else. And Jefferson, the retired Jefferson, saw the same thing. This is his fire bell in the night. He's worried about the future of the Union because he sees that these New England people they're getting a little bit aggressive. He had always resisted that. But what we get in all of this is the piece on Monday. And again, ideological. The piece on Monday entitled Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Of course, taking a page from the French Revolution, this is Gail Jarvis talking about what all of these monuments, what the destruction of Confederate monuments and these type of things actually means. It's an ideological struggle to destroy tradition. And if they can take the monuments down, that's the first step. You've now exposed the weakness. People they're going to capitalize on it. You give an inch, and they're going to take a mile. They're going to take more than a mile. They're going to take the whole darn thing. They've opened the door. You've cracked the door, and they're going to stick their foot right in it and then push it open. And it's all in the name of a French revolutionary style transformation of America. That's really what they want. And they've said it, but people don't necessarily always pay attention to this. And I think part of that is because of historical ignorance. Because of the fact that the French Revolution now, when you look at the way it's often portrayed, people of course know about the terror, but the revolution is not often portrayed the way it should be, as an ideological monstrosity that has unleashed nearly over 200 years of disruption in the world, which it has. The French Revolution doesn't happen. We don't have the Napoleonic era. Without the Napoleonic era, we don't have the major wars of unification of the 19th century, the wars of nationalism. Without that, we don't have World War I. Without World War I, we don't have World War II. Without World War II, we don't have the Cold War. And without the Cold War, we don't have the War on Terror. All of these internationalists, the neoconservatives, the city upon a hill people, and New England, of course, that became before the French Revolution, but then after, in their very aggressive ideological pursuit of making the world as they saw it in their own mind. That's Thoreau and Emerson. And doing that, the Transcendentalists, the Burnt-Over District, all of that reform is all unleashed, not by Jefferson's Declaration, but by the French Revolution. You can say the Declaration led to the French Revolution. The American War for Independence led to the French Revolution. I think you could make a case that perhaps is the case, that without the American War for Independence, the French Revolution never takes place. Maybe. I mean, the French Revolution is a whole other thing. And, of course, Americans were involved. Thomas Paine was involved. Jefferson even was involved early on. But certainly that was a different kind of revolution. And we don't have, Pol Pot in Cambodia without the French Revolution. We don't have this international communism. None of that takes place. None of that happens. We don't have Marx, perhaps, without the French Revolution. That opens a Pandora's box. It unleashes hell on the rest of the world for centuries to come. And everything that's happening now is just a part of that. It's the attack on tradition. The French, after all, were the first ones that were tearing down statues, desecrating graves, destroying churches. They were doing it during the Revolution. This is exactly what we're seeing now, but because people don't see that, they just think, oh, the French Revolution, reign of terror, lopping off some heads, oh, big deal. Because it's not taught the way it should, as a destructive and dangerous part of human history, that tradition was under assault, and tradition is the only thing that maintains any type of civilization. Civilization is under attack. You have to have tradition to have civilization. You can't have it without it. You tear it down, you have nothing left. And the French realize this. This is why Robespierre came up with his church of the cult of reason, because he said, well, people need a church. They're just going to worship me instead. And now we get the worship of the state. We have Lincoln and the Lincoln Memorial. We have various, Lincoln is a god. The Neoconservatives worship Lincoln as a god, as a demigod. They won't say that, but they do, because if you attack Lincoln, you're not going to get anywhere. You're going to be booted out of your nomination for the National Endowment for the Humanities. My gosh, how dare you commit heresy like that? If you don't say what the politically correct position of the day is, well, you're a heretic. And the neoconservatives tend to do that. This is all part of this revolutionary process. It's all part of internationalism. That's what all these things are. And the South resisted those things. The South was not ideological. The South resisted that stuff. Their entire society was based on tradition, and that is dangerous to the ideologues, because tradition and independence, more than anything else, tradition and independence are two things that can undermine the ideologue. Because someone that is independent and they enjoy their tradition does not need the ideologue in any way. The ideologue does not function well in that type of society. And so we have to think about that as we start looking at American history in this time and how things are going. And of course, these three pieces, I think, do a wonderful job of putting this together. And I hope maybe in this podcast I connected some of the dots and why the three pieces work. Because New England drove the early internationalists. They drove the early nationalists and then the sectional nationalists, which then became the internationalists, and which ultimately became progressives and neoconservatives, and whatever term you want to use. But the South and tradition has been consistently pushed aside in that way. And so that's why it is important to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition, because that tradition is the key to maintaining civilization. Until next time, good day.